"You're not his mother anymore," the security guard said quietly as he placed one hand in front of the church entrance. "The bride asked us not to let you inside." Those were the first words I heard on the morning of my own son's wedding, and for a moment, I honestly wondered if I had walked to the wrong church. I looked up at the white stone building decorated with fresh ivory roses and blue hydrangeas, exactly the flowers Ethan had told me he wanted when he was only 12 years old and dreamed about the day he would someday get married. Every ribbon fluttering in the gentle spring breeze had been tied with care. Every guest arriving wore a smile. Every church bell seemed to celebrate a future that suddenly no longer included me. I stood there in my navy blue dress, holding a small velvet box with my late husband's gold pocket watch inside. Richard had carried that watch every single day for 36 years. Before cancer took him, he pressed it into my hands and whispered, "When Ethan gets married, make sure he wears this. Tell him I'm walking beside him." I had repeated those words to myself during the entire drive across town, smiling through tears, believing this would be one of the happiest mornings of my life. Instead, strangers were politely asking me to leave. "There must be some mistake," I said softly. "I'm Margaret Collins. I'm the groom's mother." The young guard shifted awkwardly before glancing toward the wedding coordinator standing just inside the doorway. She looked down at a clipboard, avoided my eyes, then nodded once. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he replied. "Your name isn't on the guest list." Around me, conversation slowed. Guests pretending not to stare suddenly found the flower arrangements fascinating. An older couple exchanged uncomfortable glances before quietly walking inside. A little girl holding her grandmother's hand looked up at me with innocent confusion, as though she could not understand how someone's own mother could be left standing outside her son's wedding. Neither could I. I reached into my purse and carefully unfolded the cream-colored invitation Ethan himself had mailed 6 months earlier. His handwriting covered the envelope. My name was written in the same uneven style he had used ever since elementary school. I remembered teasing him that his capital M always leaned too far to the left. I held the invitation out with slightly trembling hands. "My son invited me." The coordinator barely looked at it. "Mrs. Harper updated the final guest list yesterday," she answered with practiced politeness. "We're following her instructions." "Mrs. Harper?" "Olivia. My daughter-in-law had become Mrs. Harper only minutes before the ceremony would begin, yet somehow she already had the authority to erase me." I searched the arriving guests, hoping Ethan would appear from one of the black SUVs pulling into the circular driveway. Surely he didn't know. Surely if he saw me standing here, he would come running across the sidewalk exactly the way he had when he scraped his knee learning to ride his bicycle. He had always reached for me first. That was what mothers believed would never change. Then I noticed him through the church doors. He stood near the altar adjusting his tie, while several groomsmen laughed around him. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting soft colors across his face. For one impossible second, our eyes almost met. Before he could turn toward the entrance, Olivia stepped beside him, gently touched his arm, and guided him farther into the sanctuary. The doors slowly closed between us. I did not knock. I did not argue. I simply lowered my hand, closed the velvet box around Richard's watch, and smiled with a calmness I did not truly feel. Because at that moment, although no one there realized it yet, the wedding they had worked so hard to protect had already begun to reveal the truth about the family they believed they were celebrating. I remained on the sidewalk long after the church doors closed, listening as the organ music drifted through the stained glass windows. The familiar melody echoed across the courtyard, soft enough to sound beautiful and distant enough to remind me that I no longer belonged inside. Guests continued arriving, smiling as they hurried toward the entrance, careful not to look directly at me. Some recognized my face from family photographs Ethan had once proudly displayed in his apartment years ago. Their expressions shifted from cheerful to uncertain before they quietly disappeared into the sanctuary. I could not blame them. Weddings were supposed to be joyful occasions, not places where uncomfortable questions lingered in the air. I tightened my fingers around the velvet box inside my purse, feeling the cool metal edges beneath the fabric. Richard's watch seemed heavier than it had that morning. It carried more than time. It carried promises. 28 years earlier, Ethan had stood on the front porch wearing a tiny navy suit for his elementary school graduation. His clip-on tie hung crooked, and he had insisted that I fix it 3 different times because he wanted to look important. Before we left the house, he slipped his small hand into mine and said, "Do not let go until we get there, Mom." I remembered laughing because the school was only 3 blocks away. I had no idea that one day the distance between us would feel much farther than 3 blocks. A gentle breeze lifted the edge of my jacket, carrying the scent of fresh roses from the church entrance. I looked toward the parking lot where families embraced before walking inside together. Fathers adjusted their sons' jackets. Mothers wiped away happy tears. Grandparents smiled as children raced across the pavement in polished shoes that were already collecting dust. It looked exactly like every wedding album I had ever seen. Warm, loving, complete. Only my place in that picture had quietly disappeared. My phone remained silent. No missed calls. No messages asking where I was. No worried voice wondering why the groom's mother had not taken her seat. I realized something painful then. They were not looking for me because they already believed I was exactly where Olivia wanted me to be. Outside. Forgotten. Invisible. I sat down on a wooden bench beneath an old maple tree across from the church steps. From there I could see the large stained glass window above the altar glowing in the morning sunlight. Somewhere behind that colorful glass, my son was preparing to exchange vows. I whispered a quiet prayer anyway. Not because anyone could hear me, but because a mother does not stop wishing happiness for her child simply because her own heart has been wounded. I prayed that Ethan would build a marriage filled with kindness, honesty, and respect, even though I had already begun to wonder whether those values were welcome in the life he had chosen. As the ceremony began, memories arrived one after another with remarkable clarity. I remembered helping Ethan build a wooden birdhouse in our garage when he was 10 years old. We painted it blue because he insisted birds deserved cheerful homes. I remembered long evenings spent helping with science projects spread across our kitchen table. I remembered football games, college acceptance letters, late-night phone calls after his first apartment flooded, and every birthday cake that leaned slightly to one side because decorating had never been my greatest talent. Through every stage of his life, I had believed that love quietly accumulated like family photographs stored in old albums. You never counted each memory because you assumed they would always be there. Yet sitting alone across from the church, I discovered how quickly years of devotion could be overshadowed by a single decision made without explanation. I was still watching the church doors when someone gently spoke my name from behind me, and the familiar voice immediately told me that, for the first time that morning, I was no longer completely alone. I turned slowly and found Grace Bennett standing a few feet behind me, still wearing the sage green dress she had shown me weeks earlier when she asked whether it was appropriate for the ceremony. We had been friends for more than 40 years, ever since our husbands worked together at the same engineering firm. She knew my family almost as well as I did. The moment she saw my face, she did not ask what had happened. She already knew. She sat beside me on the weathered wooden bench without saying a word. Sometimes the greatest kindness is silence shared between two people who understand pain without needing an explanation. After several moments, she reached over and gently covered my hand with hers. "Margaret," she whispered, "I have been looking for you everywhere." I forced a small smile that felt heavier than any tears could have been. "Apparently not everywhere," I answered softly. Grace lowered her eyes before taking a slow breath. I watched what happened from across the courtyard. I tried to come over sooner, but the coordinator stopped me. She said the ceremony was about to begin. Neither of us spoke for a while. The church bells faded, replaced by the quiet singing drifting through the walls. It was strange how peaceful everything sounded from outside. If someone had walked past the church without knowing the truth, they would have believed this was simply another beautiful wedding on a sunny Saturday morning. Grace finally broke the silence. "Margaret, there is something I should have told you weeks ago." I looked at her, surprised by the hesitation in her voice. Grace had always been direct, the kind of woman who believed difficult truths were better than comfortable lies. Seeing her struggle to find the right words made my stomach tighten. "About a month ago," she continued carefully, "Olivia invited several of us to lunch. She said she wanted to discuss seating arrangements and the final details for the wedding." I nodded, remembering how Olivia had insisted on handling every decision herself. She had often said it was easier if there was only one person making plans. At the time, I admired her organization. Now that confidence looked very different. Grace looked toward the church entrance before continuing in a quieter voice. Your name was on the seating chart. Front row, right beside Ethan. My heart skipped. I had never doubted Ethan would reserve that place for me. It was where Richard and I had always imagined sitting together. Grace reached into her handbag and carefully unfolded a photograph on her phone. I took this because I wanted to remember where everyone would be sitting. She handed me the device. There it was. A beautifully designed seating chart displayed on an easel. Near the top, beneath the words Groom's Family, I read my own name. Margaret Collins. Front row. Seat 1. I stared at the screen for several seconds before handing it back. That was before the final meeting, Grace said. 3 days ago, Olivia gathered the coordinator and the venue staff. She said there had been changes. She crossed your name off herself. I blinked slowly, struggling to understand. Did she explain why? Grace nodded with obvious reluctance. She said family relationships can be complicated and that some people create unnecessary drama. She told everyone the wedding would be more peaceful if certain guests did not attend. I looked down at my folded hands resting quietly in my lap. Even then I did not feel anger. I felt something colder. Clarity. Suddenly, every canceled lunch, every unanswered phone call, every holiday invitation that arrived at the last minute began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle I had never wanted to solve. Olivia had not made one impulsive decision this morning. She had been moving me farther away from Ethan one careful step at a time, and I had mistaken every step for coincidence. Grace gently squeezed my hand again. There is something else, she said. Someone arrived at the church about 20 minutes ago asking for you by name. He introduced himself as Daniel Brooks. He said it was important that he speak with you before the reception begins. Grace and I remained on the bench for another minute, neither of us speaking as the distant sound of applause echoed from inside the church. The ceremony had ended. Somewhere beyond those heavy wooden doors, Ethan and Olivia were probably walking back down the aisle as husband and wife, while photographers captured smiles that would one day fill expensive albums. Looking at the church now, no one would ever guess that the groom's mother had never been allowed to witness the vows. Grace glanced toward the parking lot and gently touched my arm. He is waiting over there. I followed her gaze and noticed a silver sedan parked beneath a row of oak trees. A tall man in a charcoal gray suit stood beside the driver's door, holding a slim leather portfolio. Even from a distance, I recognized him. Daniel Brooks had been Richard's attorney for nearly 20 years. He had handled our estate planning, our home purchase, and eventually every legal document during Richard's long illness. He had attended the funeral quietly, standing in the last row without asking for attention. Seeing him here today felt anything but accidental. As we approached, Daniel removed his glasses and offered me a respectful smile filled with sympathy rather than surprise. Mrs. Collins, he said warmly, I wish we were meeting under happier circumstances. I nodded. So do I. He looked briefly toward the church before lowering his voice. Richard asked me to give you something if a particular situation ever happened. I spent years hoping I would never need to fulfill that request. My heart tightened. Richard had always planned carefully. He believed love was shown through preparation, whether that meant replacing the furnace before winter or writing birthday cards weeks in advance, because he never wanted anyone to feel forgotten. Daniel opened the leather portfolio and carefully removed a large cream envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Across the front, written in Richard's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "For Margaret. Only if the family she protected forgets to protect her." My fingers trembled as I accepted the envelope. For a long moment, I simply traced the familiar handwriting with my thumb. It had been almost 3 years since I had seen Richard write anything. Suddenly, it felt as though he were standing beside me again. He left detailed instructions. Daniel continued quietly. He made me promise that I would not deliver this unless you experienced a serious public humiliation caused by immediate family. He was very specific about those words. I looked up at him in disbelief. Why would he expect something like this? Daniel hesitated before answering. I do not believe he expected it. I believe he feared it. Those words settled heavily in the silence between us. Richard had noticed things I had chosen not to see. During his final year, he occasionally asked gentle questions about Olivia. Had she returned my phone calls? Had Ethan visited recently? Had holiday plans suddenly changed? I always found reasonable explanations because that was easier than imagining distance where love should have been. Daniel reached into the portfolio once more and removed a second sealed folder. There are additional documents inside this packet, but Richard instructed me that you should read his letter first. After that, if you wish, I will explain everything else. I carefully held both envelopes against my chest without opening them. Somehow it did not feel right to read Richard's final words in a crowded parking lot while wedding guests celebrated only a few hundred feet away. I wanted to hear his voice in my heart without distractions. Daniel seemed to understand. The reception begins in less than an hour at the Grand Willow Ballroom, he said calmly. I have been invited because I represent the Collins Family Trust. My attendance is expected. I looked at him with quiet confusion. The trust? He nodded once. Yes, Mrs. Collins. And before today is over, several people are going to discover that Richard planned much further ahead than anyone ever imagined. After Daniel left to prepare for the reception, Grace offered to drive me home so I could have a few quiet moments before deciding what to do next. The church parking lot gradually emptied behind us, and neither of us felt any need to fill the silence with comforting words that would never be enough. As familiar streets passed outside the window, I rested Richard's sealed letter on my lap with one hand while the small velvet box remained in the other. Somehow both felt connected, as though the watch and the letter had been waiting years to meet on this very day. When we arrived at my house, Grace walked me to the front porch and gently hugged me. Whatever happens this afternoon, she whispered, remember that none of this changes the kind of mother you have always been. I smiled gratefully before watching her drive away. The house greeted me with the same peaceful stillness it always had. Sunlight filtered through the living room curtains, falling across the framed family photographs lining the fireplace mantel. There was Ethan at 5 years old, proudly holding the first fish he had ever caught with Richard. There he was again in his high school graduation gown, wrapping both arms around me before accepting his diploma. In another picture, we stood together outside his college dormitory, laughing because we had packed far too many boxes for a room barely large enough to hold a twin bed and a small desk. Every photograph reminded me of the same truth. Families are not built in a single day. They are built one ordinary moment at a time, through thousands of quiet acts of love that rarely appear important until someone pretends they never happened. I carried the letter into Richard's study, the one room I had left almost exactly as he had arranged it. His favorite fountain pen still rested beside a leather notebook. A worn baseball cap hung on the corner of the bookshelf exactly where he had left it after mowing the lawn one summer afternoon. Sitting down in his old chair, I carefully broke the blue wax seal and unfolded several neatly written pages. The first line blurred instantly as tears filled my eyes. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then someone has mistaken your kindness for weakness. I paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. Richard's words sounded exactly like his voice. Calm, thoughtful, certain. He wrote that during his illness, he had spent many quiet evenings observing changes within the family. He noticed conversations ending whenever I entered a room. He noticed invitations arriving later each year. He noticed how often I defended people who made little effort to defend me. He admitted that he had hoped he was simply worrying too much, yet he believed a husband should prepare for possibilities even when he prayed they would never become reality. The next page explained why Daniel had mentioned the Collins Family Trust. Richard revealed that nearly every major family asset, including several investment accounts and properties inherited from his parents, had been transferred into a carefully structured trust years before his death. He explained that the purpose was never to control Ethan's future. Instead, it was to protect the values that had built our family in the first place: respect, gratitude, integrity. Finally, I reached a paragraph that made me slowly lower the pages into my lap. Richard wrote that if I were ever publicly humiliated, deliberately excluded, or treated without basic dignity by an immediate family member seeking personal advantage, Daniel was authorized to suspend all discretionary distributions from the trust until a complete legal review could determine whether the family's founding conditions had been violated. I read those sentences twice to make certain grief was not changing their meaning. Richard had never wanted revenge. He wanted accountability. At the bottom of the final page, he had added one handwritten sentence separate from everything else. Never fight to keep people who are willing to lose you, Margaret. Simply remember who you are, and let the truth arrive in its own time. I folded the letter carefully, placed Richard's watch beside it, And for the first time since that morning, I no longer felt like the woman left standing outside a church door. I felt like the keeper of a promise my husband had trusted me to honor. The afternoon sun had begun to settle behind the downtown skyline when I finished folding Richard's letter and placed it back inside its envelope. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel angry. What surprised me most was the calm that slowly replaced the ache I had carried all morning. Richard had given me something far greater than financial protection. He had given me permission to stop chasing acceptance from people who had already decided to withhold it. I walked upstairs and changed into another navy blue dress, one slightly simpler than the one I had worn to the church. I brushed my silver hair, fastened the pearl earrings Richard had given me on our 30th wedding anniversary, and slipped his gold pocket watch into my handbag beside the letter. Before leaving the house, I paused in front of the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me appeared tired, but she no longer looked defeated. I quietly locked the front door and drove toward the Grand Willow Ballroom. The parking lot was already filled with luxury cars decorated with white ribbons and tiny bouquets tied to their mirrors. Valets hurried from one vehicle to another while cheerful laughter drifted through the entrance. Guests gathered on the stone patio holding glasses of sparkling cider and chatting about the beautiful ceremony they had just witnessed. I parked several rows away and remained inside my car for a moment, watching families pose for photographs beneath strings of elegant lights. Once again, I realized how easy it was for appearances to convince people that everything was perfect. No photograph could capture who had been left outside the church doors only a few hours earlier. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the ballroom entrance at an unhurried pace. This time no one stopped me. The reception staff welcomed arriving guests without checking names because the celebration was already underway. Soft piano music floated through the open doors, blending with conversation and occasional applause. I entered quietly and stood near the back of the beautifully decorated ballroom. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across dozens of round tables covered with white linen and pale blue flowers. A large dance floor stretched through the center of the room beneath an enormous arrangement of hanging greenery. On the stage stood Ethan and Olivia greeting relatives with polished smiles. From where I stood, they looked like the picture of happiness. Ethan laughed as one of his college friends embraced him. Olivia accepted compliments with effortless confidence, thanking everyone for coming while photographers captured every graceful moment. Neither of them noticed me. I was almost grateful for that. I was not there to interrupt their celebration. I was there because Richard had believed truth deserved to arrive with dignity rather than anger. As I quietly observed the room, familiar faces began recognizing me. Several cousins looked surprised to see me entering so late. An elderly aunt approached with genuine concern. "Margaret," she said softly, "we wondered where you had been during the ceremony. We assumed you were helping Ethan prepare." I smiled politely. Things did not happen exactly as planned. She looked puzzled, but before she could ask another question, someone announced that dinner would soon be served. The room gradually settled into quiet conversation as guests found their assigned tables. I noticed there was no place card with my name anywhere in the ballroom. Even here, every seat had been carefully arranged to ensure my absence appeared completely natural. I simply remained standing near one of the large windows overlooking the gardens. Moments later, Daniel Brooks entered through a side doorway carrying the same leather portfolio I had seen earlier. He exchanged brief greetings with several members of Ethan's extended family before his eyes met mine across the room. He gave the slightest nod, calm and professional, then continued toward the front where the master of ceremonies was preparing to begin the evening program. Watching him walk with quiet confidence, I remembered Richard's final handwritten sentence. Never fight to keep people who are willing to lose you. Let the truth arrive in its own time. As the microphone was switched on and the room gradually fell silent, I realized that time had finally arrived. The master of ceremonies welcomed everyone with a cheerful smile, thanking family and friends for sharing such a meaningful day before inviting several guests to offer short toasts to the newly married couple. Laughter filled the ballroom as Ethan's college roommate shared an embarrassing story from their freshman year. Olivia's sister followed with warm memories from childhood. Crystal glasses were raised again and again while servers quietly moved between the tables, placing dinner plates in front of smiling guests. From my place beside the tall windows, I watched everything unfold with surprising peace. Earlier that morning, I had believed the hardest part of my life was standing outside the church doors. Now I realized something far more difficult had happened long before today. Somewhere over the past several years, my son had slowly stopped noticing when I disappeared. That realization hurt more deeply than any public humiliation ever could. As another round of applause echoed through the ballroom, the master of ceremonies adjusted the microphone once again. "Before dinner continues," he announced, "we have one final guest who has been asked to say a few words on behalf of the Collins family." I noticed Ethan glance toward Olivia with mild curiosity. She smiled confidently, apparently believing one of Richard's old business partners had arranged a surprise congratulatory message. Instead, Daniel Brooks calmly rose from his seat near the front of the room. Carrying his familiar leather portfolio, he walked to the microphone with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades speaking carefully rather than loudly. Several relatives recognized him immediately and greeted him with polite smiles. Daniel thanked the master of ceremonies before looking around the ballroom. "Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Brooks. I had the privilege of serving as Richard Collins's attorney and trusted advisor for many years." At the mention of Richard's name, Ethan's expression softened. Olivia remained relaxed, gently placing one hand over his. Daniel continued in the same measured voice. "Richard believed that important family milestones should also be opportunities to honor promises made across generations. Several years before his passing, he established detailed instructions regarding the Collins family trust. He directed that I attend certain future family events if specific conditions required my presence." Quiet curiosity spread across the room. Guests exchanged uncertain glances, wondering why a family attorney was speaking during a wedding reception. Daniel opened his portfolio and removed a neatly organized folder. "I want to make something very clear," he said. "This is not intended to interrupt today's celebration. Richard always hoped these documents would never need to be discussed publicly. Unfortunately, circumstances have made that impossible." Olivia's smile faded almost imperceptibly. Ethan looked from Daniel toward the audience, clearly trying to understand what was happening. Daniel paused before continuing. "This morning, before the wedding ceremony began, I confirmed that Mrs. Margaret Collins, Richard's wife and Ethan's mother, was intentionally denied entry to the ceremony despite having received a formal invitation months earlier." The ballroom became completely silent. Forks stopped moving. Conversations disappeared. Even the servers quietly stepped back. Ethan slowly turned toward the entrance as though expecting to find me there. Olivia's shoulders stiffened beside him. Daniel continued without raising his voice. "Richard anticipated that family relationships might someday be tested. Therefore, he included a protective provision within the Collins family trust. If his wife were ever deliberately subjected to public humiliation or intentionally excluded by an immediate family member for personal advantage, all discretionary trust distributions would immediately enter legal review until the trustees determined whether the family's governing principles had been violated." A quiet murmur moved through the ballroom. Several relatives stared openly at Ethan and Olivia. Others looked toward me as they finally noticed I had been standing quietly at the back of the room the entire time. Ethan's face lost all color as our eyes finally met across the crowded ballroom. For the first time that day, he truly saw me. Daniel gently closed the folder before adding one final sentence. "Mrs. Collins has requested no confrontation and no interruption of this celebration. She has conducted herself today with remarkable dignity. My responsibility is simply to fulfill Richard Collins's lawful instructions exactly as he entrusted them to me." In the silence that followed, no one applauded. No one spoke. The only sound in the ballroom was the quiet ticking of Richard's gold pocket watch inside my handbag, reminding me that truth, no matter how patiently it waits, always arrives exactly when its time has come. For several long seconds, no one moved. The ballroom that had been filled with cheerful conversation only moments earlier now felt suspended in complete silence. I could see questions forming on every face as guests tried to understand what they had just heard. Some looked toward Daniel. Others looked toward Ethan. Many quietly turned to me. I remained exactly where I was beside the tall windows, my hands resting lightly on my handbag, offering no expression of victory because there was nothing about this moment that felt like winning. Ethan slowly stepped away from the head table, his eyes never leaving mine. The confident smile he had worn all afternoon had disappeared, replaced by confusion and disbelief. Halfway across the ballroom, he stopped and looked toward Olivia. "Is what Daniel said true?" he asked quietly. His voice was calm, but everyone nearby could hear every word because the room remained so still. Olivia forced a small laugh that sounded unfamiliar even to herself. "This is not the time for this conversation," she answered. "Your mother is making today about herself." Ethan frowned. "That is not what I asked." Olivia glanced around the room and noticed dozens of relatives watching her. "I only did what I thought was best," she replied. "I wanted a peaceful wedding. Your mother always makes everything emotional." I watched Ethan close his eyes for a brief moment, as though trying to remember something important. Then he looked back at me. "Mom," he said, almost in a whisper, "were you really outside the church the whole time?" I nodded once. "Yes. Why did nobody tell me?" The question hung in the air unanswered. Olivia folded her arms. "Because there was no reason to upset you before the ceremony. Everything would have turned into unnecessary drama." Ethan stared at her with growing disbelief. "You told security to keep my own mother outside?" Olivia hesitated just long enough for everyone to understand the answer before she finally spoke. "I made the decision because I thought it would make the day easier." Ethan slowly lowered his head. "Easier for whom?" No one answered. Grace quietly stepped forward from one of the nearby tables. "Ethan," she said gently, "your mother never argued with anyone. She stood outside carrying your father's watch because she wanted you to have it before you walked down the aisle." Ethan looked at the velvet box I carefully removed from my handbag. His eyes immediately filled with regret. "Dad's watch?" he whispered. I opened the box without saying anything. The polished gold case reflected the warm chandelier light exactly as it had reflected sunlight in Richard's hands for decades. Ethan recognized it instantly. "He wanted you to wear it today," I said softly. "That was his last request to me." Ethan covered his mouth with one trembling hand. I never knew. I believed him. Looking into my son's eyes, I realized he had known far less than he should have. Somewhere along the way, he had allowed someone else to manage every conversation, every invitation, every decision until he no longer noticed what was missing. Olivia took a step toward him. "Ethan, please. Everyone is watching." He turned toward her with quiet sadness rather than anger. "That is exactly the problem," he answered. I stopped watching. Those simple words seemed to echo throughout the ballroom. Several relatives lowered their eyes. Others silently nodded as though pieces of a much larger puzzle had suddenly fallen into place. Daniel remained near the front of the room without interrupting. He had fulfilled Richard's instructions. The rest belonged to our family. Ethan slowly walked the remaining distance between us before stopping only a few feet away. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking for the first time since he was a little boy. "I cannot change what happened this morning. But I finally understand that the person who was left outside the church was never the one who lost the most today. I was." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I looked at the man standing before me and could still see flashes of the little boy who used to wait by the front window every evening until Richard and I came home from work. Life had added gray at his temples and confidence to his posture, but regret had a way of making even adults look like children searching for the safety they once took for granted. I reached into my handbag, removed Richard's gold pocket watch, and placed the velvet box gently into Ethan's hands. He stared at it in silence before carefully opening the lid. His fingers traced the engraved initials that had belonged to his father for more than 3 decades. A single tear rolled down his cheek. "I should have been standing beside you this morning," he whispered. "Instead, I never even asked where you were." I smiled gently. "The hardest part was not standing outside the church, Ethan. The hardest part was realizing that you did not notice I was missing." He lowered his head, unable to answer. Around us, the ballroom remained quiet. No one seemed interested in dinner anymore. Every person present understood that they were witnessing something much more important than a wedding reception. Olivia stood several feet away, saying nothing. The confidence she had carried throughout the day had quietly disappeared. She looked around the room, perhaps hoping someone would defend her decisions, but no one stepped forward. This was no longer about arguments or blame. It was about choices, and every choice leaves a lasting mark. Ethan closed the watch and held it carefully against his chest. "Can you ever forgive me?" he asked. I thought about Richard's letter resting safely inside my handbag. I remembered the final sentence he had written with such steady confidence. Never fight to keep people who are willing to lose you. Simply remember who you are and let the truth arrive in its own time. The truth had arrived. What happened next belonged to me alone. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, I answered quietly. I forgive you because carrying bitterness would only make my own heart heavier. But trust grows slowly. It is built through actions, not promises. Ethan nodded, accepting every word without argument. For the first time in many years, he listened instead of assuming. Daniel approached respectfully and stopped a short distance away. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "there is no need for any decisions today regarding the trust. The review process will follow its normal course, and everyone involved will be treated fairly." I thanked him with a simple nod. Richard had never wanted our family divided by money. He had wanted us united by character. Whatever happened with the legal process would simply reflect the choices already made. I turned once more toward Ethan. "Your father believed wealth could build houses," I said, "but only kindness could build a home. Never confuse the two." He quietly repeated those words to himself, as though trying to memorize them forever. I smiled one last time before walking toward the ballroom doors. No one tried to stop me. Several relatives gently stepped aside, offering warm smiles filled with understanding. Grace embraced me near the entrance, and together we walked outside into the cool evening air. The sun was beginning to disappear beyond the trees, painting the sky with soft shades of gold and lavender. I paused before getting into my car and looked back at the ballroom glowing with hundreds of tiny lights. That building had witnessed both the deepest humiliation and the quiet return of my dignity in a single afternoon. I finally understood that they had never succeeded in keeping me out of my son's wedding. They had only revealed who was willing to close a door and who still believed it should have remained open. As I drove home beneath the fading evening sky, I felt Richard beside me in every memory, every lesson, and every promise we had shared. Some families are held together by photographs, traditions, or inheritances. Ours would have one more chance, not because of money, but because truth had finally spoken louder than silence. And sometimes that is where healing quietly begins.